She remembered every detail of that morning. The charcoal blazer she had pressed the night before. The portfolio she had reorganized 4 times until the work samples were arranged in exactly the order that told the story she wanted them to tell. The specific route she had taken on the subway because she had timed it twice in the week before the interview and knew it would get her there 8 minutes early, which was the right amount of early, enough to signal that she took the opportunity seriously, not so much that she looked uncertain about whether she belonged. She had sat in the lobby of that building for those 8 minutes and had looked at the company name on the wall above the reception desk and had allowed herself, quietly and deliberately, to believe that she was going to get this job. Not because she was hoping. Because she had done the work. Because she knew what she knew. Because she had spent 6 years preparing for exactly this kind of moment, and she was ready for it in every way she could be ready. And when the receptionist called her name, and she stood and walked toward the elevator that would take her to the 14th floor, she had felt, for the first time in a long time, that the distance between where she was and where she was going was closing. The interview lasted 43 minutes. She answered every question clearly. She asked questions that demonstrated she had done research that went beyond the company website. She presented her portfolio with the confidence of someone who believed in what they had made. She left the 14th floor having given everything she had brought with her to give. And 45 minutes after she walked in through the lobby, she walked back out through the glass front doors onto the sidewalk in Charlotte, North Carolina, and stood in the morning light and understood, from the specific language the interviewer had used in the final 3 minutes of the conversation, that she was not going to get the job. Not because her preparation had failed her, not because her answers had been inadequate, because of something that had nothing to do with her preparation or her answers, something the interviewer had communicated in the careful, diplomatic language of someone who has decided before the conversation began and is now managing the conclusion of it. Her background, they said, was not quite the right fit for where the company was headed. Her experience, while impressive for someone at her stage, did not align with what they needed at this time. They wished her every success in her search. She thanked them. She shook their hands with the same composure she had brought into the room. She took the elevator back to the lobby. She walked through the glass doors, and she stood on the sidewalk in the morning light and looked at the building and made herself a promise, quietly, in the specific interior voice of someone who is not performing for anyone. She said, "I will be back." And then she walked to the subway and went home and began the next part of the story that morning had just started. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 10 years later, Simone Reeves walked back through those same glass doors. She was 34 years old. She was wearing a different blazer, this one custom, this one a color that she had chosen specifically because it was the one she felt most completely herself in. She carried a different portfolio. She was not carrying it because she needed it. She was carrying it because it was a habit she had maintained for a decade, and that had, across that decade, become part of how she thought about arriving anywhere. Prepared. Always prepared. The lobby of the building had been renovated since the morning she had last been in it. The reception desk was in a different position. The company name on the wall was rendered in a different typeface, but the bones of the space were the same, the elevator banks in the same location, the ceiling the same height, the light coming through the front windows at the same angle. She walked in and she checked in with the receptionist, and she waited for the person who was coming to escort her upstairs. And while she waited, she became aware of a man sitting in one of the lobby chairs, 60-something, well-dressed, reading something on his phone with the distracted attention of someone who is waiting for a meeting. He looked up when she walked past him toward the reception desk, and she saw the moment of recognition cross his face. the specific adjustment of an expression that happens when someone realizes they know a face and is trying to locate where they know it from, and then the further adjustment when the location arrived. She had been 24 years old the last time he had seen her. She was 34 now, but she had the same eyes and the same posture, and she was walking into the building he worked in as the person who was about to become his new boss. She did not stop walking. She acknowledged his presence with the brief, composed nod of someone who has noted a thing without requiring it to be a moment. And then she walked past him toward the elevator and went upstairs and began her first day as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Consulting Group, the company that had told her, 10 years earlier, that her background was not quite the right fit. This is the story of everything that happened in between, and it is considerably more interesting than the ending. Simone Reeves had grown up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the first of 3 daughters born to Robert and Cecilia Reeves. Robert had spent 31 years as a high school history teacher. He had also coached the debate team for 22 of those years, not because the coaching stipend was meaningful, but because he understood that what he was teaching in that room, how to build an argument, how to listen before you speak, how to remain composed when someone challenges the thing you believe, was more useful to his students than most of what the curriculum required of them. Cecilia had run a catering business from their home kitchen for the first 8 years of Simone's childhood, taking calls in the morning and managing events at night, treating every client's occasion with the specific seriousness of someone who understood that what she was being trusted with was not just food, but memory. The business had grown. By the time Simone was 15, Cecilia had moved it out of the house and into a small commercial kitchen with 2 employees. By the time Simone left for college, it had 3. What Simone had absorbed from both of her parents was not reducible to a lesson. It was a posture. The posture of people who understood that the quality of their work was a form of self-expression, that showing up completely was not optional. That reputation was built in the moments when no one was formally evaluating you, and that the evaluation was always ultimately coming. She carried this into school with the result that she was not the loudest student in her classes, but consistently the most prepared. She carried it into the 2 internships she completed during her undergraduate years at North Carolina A&T State University, a business administration degree that she graduated with honors, and into the work experiences that followed graduation. She was, by every account of the people who worked with her in those early years, someone whose quality was visible before her credentials were reviewed. Someone who made the work she touched better. Someone who understood at 22 and 23 and 24 things about organizational dynamics and strategic positioning that people twice her age were still working toward. She was ready for the job she had applied for at Meridian. She had been ready for 6 years. The people who interviewed her had not been able to see it. And the question this story keeps returning to is why. And the answer to that question is not simple. And understanding it is the only way to understand everything that came after. The company Simone had applied to at 24 was Meridian Consulting Group, a mid-sized management consulting firm based in Charlotte with offices in 3 other cities and a client list that included regional healthcare systems, financial services companies, and a growing portfolio of technology sector clients who were trying to scale without losing the operational coherence they had built at smaller sizes. Meridian had a reputation in the industry for producing good work, for having a culture that was demanding and that rewarded performance, and for being in a way that its leadership would not have described explicitly, but that showed clearly in its hiring patterns and its promotion history, a particular kind of place. The kind of place that had a strong intuition about who fit. And that intuition in practice produced teams that looked and sounded and came from very similar places. Not by policy, not by intention anyone would have articulated, by the accumulated weight of decisions made by people who trusted their instincts about fit and whose instincts had been formed inside a specific set of experiences that were not universal. The interviewer who had sat across from Simone on that Tuesday morning was a man named Philip Graves. He was 46 at the time. He had been with Meridian for 14 years. He was a managing director in the strategy practice, and he was, by every professional measure available, good at his job. He was also someone who had spent his entire career in environments that looked like him and that had, without his having examined it particularly carefully, formed his sense of what consulting talent looked like. When Simone walked into the room, he had been polite. He had been professional. He had asked reasonable questions and had listened to the answers. What he had not done was revise his initial assessment of her candidacy based on what he heard. The initial assessment had been formed from a resume review, from the school she had attended, North Carolina A&T, which was a fine institution but not the one his firm typically recruited from. From the internship companies she had worked for, solid regional firms but not the national ones he considered definitive, from the zip code on her address. From the specific accumulation of small signals that told him, before she opened her mouth, that she was not quite the right fit. He had not examined any of this. It had not occurred to him to examine it. He had experienced it as instinct, as judgment, as the professional intuition of someone who knew what the firm needed, and when she had performed well in the interview, better than he had expected, which he had noted in his own internal narrative as a pleasant surprise, he had managed the gap between her performance and his assessment by concluding that while she showed promise, she was perhaps not quite ready for the level they were hiring at, perhaps the right profile for a more junior role if one came available. He had filed her resume in the system with a notation that amounted to "not at this time" and had moved on to the next candidate. He had not thought about her again, until the morning in the lobby 10 years later when she walked past him into the building he worked in and was introduced, at the all-hands meeting that afternoon, as the company's incoming CEO. The morning had cost him nothing that he had noticed at the time. It had cost Simone something, but not what he would have assumed. The rejection from Meridian was the third Simone had received that month. It was the 7th that year. She had graduated with honors from a program she was proud of and had spent 14 months applying to positions she was qualified for at firms she wanted to work for and had received, consistently, the same diplomatic language about fit and timing and the very best in her search. She had a mentor, a professor from her undergraduate program named Dr. Angela Marsh, who had watched Simone develop over 4 years and who understood precisely what she was watching unfold in the hiring process and who had the specific anger of someone who has seen this pattern so many times that the anger has become something denser and more useful than feeling, something closer to strategy. Dr. Marsh had sat with Simone after the Meridian rejection and had said 2 things. The first was, "What they saw when you walked in that room was not what you actually are." And the gap between those 2 things is the work. Not the work of changing who you are. The work of making the gap impossible for them to maintain. The second was, in the meantime, you are going to work, and you are going to learn everything, and you are going to build something that cannot be questioned. And you are going to be patient in the way that is not passive, patient in the way that is actually preparation. Simone had written both things down. She had kept the paper. She had returned to it more than once in the 10 years that followed, particularly in the moments when patience felt indistinguishable from being stuck, particularly in the moments when the gap between where she was and where she was going felt less like closing and more like widening. There were several of those moments. They are part of the story. They are, in some ways, the most important part of it. She took a position at a small regional consulting firm in Greensboro. Not her first choice, not her 10th choice, but a real job with real clients and real work, and she approached it with the same completeness she had brought to everything else. Within the first 6 months, she had become the person her manager called when something needed to be done correctly on a timeline that did not allow for mistakes, not because she had performed for her manager, because she had performed for the clients, because every piece of work she touched was better than what had been produced before she touched it, because the quality was visible and verifiable and could not be attributed to anything except the person doing the work. She stayed for 2 years, not because she could not have left sooner, because 2 years was what she needed to build what she was building. In her second year, she took on 3 projects that were above her formal job description and delivered results on all 3 that exceeded what the clients had expected. She documented all of it, carefully, the way her father had taught her to document an argument, with precision, with evidence, with the understanding that a claim without support is just an opinion, and that an opinion is exactly what people with institutional bias use against you when they want to. By the time she left the firm in Greensboro, she had a portfolio of documented results that was not a matter of opinion. It was a record, and it was irrefutable. She moved to Charlotte. She joined a larger firm, not Meridian, but a firm of comparable size in the same market, one that had come to her through a referral from a client she had worked with in Greensboro. The referral was important not just because it got her in the door, but because of what it represented. A client she had served well enough that they had, without being asked, told someone else about her. This is how the reputation Dr. Marsh had described began to build. Not through networking events or LinkedIn optimization or any of the strategies that career advice articles recommend. Through the specific accumulated effect of doing good work for people who then talked about it. She spent 3 years at the Charlotte firm. She was promoted twice. She was the lead strategist on the firm's largest client engagement in her final year there. When she left, 3 of her colleagues left to follow her, not because she had recruited them, because they had watched her work and had decided she was the person they wanted to work for. This is also how reputation builds, in the specific decision of people who have options and choose you anyway. The third firm was where things accelerated in ways that required her to operate at a level of sustained excellence that she would later describe, in the one extended interview she gave after the Meridian appointment, as the period in which she understood what she was actually capable of. Not in a comfortable way. In the way of someone who is asked repeatedly to do things they have not done before and discovers, in the doing of them, that the edge of their capacity is further out than they had mapped it. She was given a failing client relationship and rebuilt it. She was given an internal team that had lost confidence in its leadership and restructured it. She was asked to present to a board of directors for the first time, and did so with the composure of someone who had been doing it for years. She was asked, 2 years into her time at that firm, to lead the entire strategy practice. She was 31 years old. She said yes, not because she was certain, because she understood that the gap Dr. Marsh had described, the gap between what they saw when she walked in the room and what she actually was, could not be closed by certainty. It could only be closed by results, and results required accepting the opportunities that produced them. The leadership of the strategy practice transformed the firm's performance in the 2 years she held it. Not by dramatic intervention, by the patient, systematic application of better thinking to every part of the practice that touched client outcomes. She changed how projects were staffed. She changed how client relationships were managed. She changed how the firm measured its own success, moving metrics from outputs to outcomes in a way that forced the organization to think about what it was actually delivering rather than how much work it was producing. The practice's client retention went up. The practice's client referrals went up. The practice's revenue went up. All of these things were documented. All of them were attributable, in the analysis that anyone who looked carefully could conduct, to the decisions and the work of the person leading the practice. Her name began to appear in places that names appear when an industry is paying attention, not loudly, in the specific, credentialed way of a reputation that has been built from the ground up and that therefore carries a different weight than a reputation built from visibility. She was invited to speak at 2 industry conferences. She accepted both. She published 2 pieces in industry journals, one on organizational resilience and one on what she had come to understand about the difference between firms that scale effectively and firms that scale chaotically. Both pieces were circulated broadly within the consulting industry. Both were cited by practitioners who found in them things they had been thinking but had not been able to articulate. She was not famous. She was known. There is a distinction. Famous is visible. Known is trusted. Known is what happens when the people who matter in your field have seen your work and formed an opinion of it based on the work itself. Known is what she had spent 10 years building. And it was the currency that, when the board of Meridian Consulting Group convened to begin its CEO search 18 months before she walked back through those glass doors, was already in the room before her name was formally placed in consideration. The search had been initiated because Meridian's current CEO, a man named Douglas Hartley, who had run the firm for 11 years, had announced his retirement. The board had engaged an executive search firm to conduct the process. The search firm had, in the standard way of such processes, assembled a list of candidates from across the industry. The list had gone through several rounds of evaluation. Simone's name had appeared on the initial long list because her reputation preceded her in the specific, documented way that made her impossible to exclude from a serious process. She had been on the long list before she was contacted. By the time she was contacted, she was already on the short list. The conversation with the search firm had been direct. She had asked questions that demonstrated she had already thought about what the CEO of Meridian needed to accomplish and why. She had been specific about the strategic priorities she believed the firm needed to address. She had been honest about what she did not yet know and clear about how she would approach learning it. The board had found this unusual, not because they had not encountered capable candidates, because the combination of her documented track record, her strategic clarity, and the specific quality of her honesty about her own edges was not something they had seen in the same person. They had offered her the position. She had taken 2 weeks to consider it, not because she was uncertain about wanting it, because she believed that the decision deserved 2 weeks. Because she had learned, in 10 years of doing difficult work carefully, that the quality of a decision is often determined by the time taken before making it rather than the confidence with which it is made. At the end of 2 weeks, she had called the board chair and said yes, and then she had called Dr. Angela Marsh, who was retired now, but who answered on the first ring. And Simone had told her what had happened, and Dr. Marsh had said, "Tell me about the building," and Simone had described the glass doors and the lobby, and the company name on the wall, and the morning 14 years earlier when she had sat in the lobby for 8 minutes and believed she was going to get the job. Dr. Marsh had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, "The work was always the answer. You just had to do enough of it that they couldn't look past it anymore." Simone had said, "That's what you told me." Dr. Marsh had said, "I know. I needed to hear you say it back to me." The man in the lobby on her first morning was Philip Graves. He was 56 years old now. He was still a managing director at Meridian. He had been there for 26 years. He had, in the 10 years since he had conducted the interview that produced the "not at this time" notation in Simone's candidate file, managed more junior consultants than he could accurately count, and had built a reputation within the firm for knowing talent when he saw it. He had, during the CEO search process, been peripherally aware that a new leader was being appointed, but had not been involved in the process directly. He had first heard Simone's name in the context of the appointment when the board chair had sent the all-staff communication announcing the new CEO 2 weeks before her start date. He had read the name and the brief biography and had experienced a specific sensation that he would later describe in the account he gave to a colleague he trusted as the feeling of a floor tilting beneath you. He had gone into his files. He had found the notation, the not at this time, the background not quite the right fit. He had sat with the file for a long time. He had not shared this with anyone immediately. He had arrived at work on her first morning and had been sitting in the lobby because he had a client meeting in 30 minutes and had arrived early for no reason that he had articulated to himself. He had been on his phone when she walked in. He had looked up, and he had recognized her in the way that a face you filed away a decade ago resurfaces when it is suddenly, immediately relevant. She had looked at him once, the brief, composed nod of someone who had noted his presence without requiring it to be a moment, and then she had walked past him toward the elevator. And he had sat in the lobby for the remaining 22 minutes before his client meeting and had thought about the file and the notation and the morning in that room on the 14th floor. He would later request a private meeting with Simone in the 3rd month of her tenure. He had prepared for it more carefully than he had prepared for anything in years. He had written out what he wanted to say and had crossed it out and rewritten it twice. When he sat across from her, in the office on the 14th floor that was now hers, he had said, "I want to acknowledge something that I don't think I can in good conscience continue to leave unacknowledged." She had looked at him with the composed attention she brought to every conversation. He had told her about the file, the notation, the morning. He had said, "I reviewed your work during this search process, the documented results, the industry reputation, the things you built, and I want to say clearly that the assessment I made in that interview was not accurate. It was not based on the work. It was based on something that I was not examining at the time and that I should have been." He had stopped there. He had not offered an explanation. He had not offered justification. He had made the statement and then he had waited for her response. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "I appreciate you saying that directly. And I want you to know that what I need from you now is the same thing I need from everyone on this team. Good work, clear thinking, the willingness to examine what you believe when the evidence suggests the belief might need revising." She had held his gaze for a moment. "Can you give me that?" He had said yes. She had nodded. The meeting had lasted 11 minutes in total. It was, by his account, one of the most important 11 minutes of his professional life. What Simone Reeves did in her first 2 years as CEO of Meridian Consulting Group is a story that has been covered in the business press and in industry publications, and does not need to be reconstructed in detail here. What can be said with accuracy is that it was not a dramatic transformation story. It was not the story of someone sweeping in and dismantling everything that had come before. It was the story of someone who had spent 10 years understanding, from the outside and then from increasingly senior positions on the inside, what firms like Meridian did well and what they did not, and what the difference was between the two. She made changes that were structural and that were built on analysis rather than impulse. She changed the firm's hiring processes in ways that required its managers to examine and document the basis for their assessments of candidates rather than relying on instinct that had never been tested against evidence. She changed the way the firm measured client success. She changed the composition of the firm's leadership team over time, not rapidly, not punitively, but by making decisions about who to develop and promote that were based on documented performance rather than cultural familiarity. She gave the first keynote address at the firm's annual client summit in her 2nd year as CEO. She had been asked what she wanted her theme to be. She had said, "The cost of what we don't see." The speech had lasted 40 minutes. It had been about the specific, concrete, measurable business cost of decisions made on the basis of pattern recognition that has not been examined, of assessments formed before the evidence is in, of the candidates who were not quite the right fit, who went on to build things that the organizations that turned them away were later paying to learn from. It had not been a speech about identity or politics or social justice in any of the framings that make certain audiences defensive. It had been a speech about business outcomes, about return on investment, about what it costs a firm when the person conducting the hiring has not examined the basis of their instincts. The applause had lasted longer than any keynote applause she had witnessed at a professional event in a decade of attending them. Philip Graves had been in the room. He had started clapping before most of the people around him. He had been one of the last to stop. Dr. Angela Marsh attended the speech. Simone had sent her a ticket. She had flown in from the retirement community in Raleigh, where she had been living for 4 years. She had sat in the 4th row. She had listened to every word with the specific quality of attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear something said publicly that she has known privately for longer than she can accurately count. After the speech, Simone had found her in the reception that followed. They had stood together near a window that overlooked the city. Dr. Marsh had said, "That was the right speech." Simone had said, "You gave me the thesis." Dr. Marsh had said, "I gave you the direction. You did the decade." They had stood together for a while without talking. The city was visible below them. Charlotte, where Simone had sat on a sidewalk at 24 and made a promise to herself. The speech had been about business outcomes. But Dr. Marsh knew, and Simone knew, and anyone who understood the full story knew that it was also about something else. About what happens when someone decides that a rejection is not a verdict, that a not at this time is not a final answer, that the gap between what people see when you walk in the room and what you actually are is not something that has to be accepted, that it is something that can be closed. 1 year at a time, one piece of documented work at a time, one client served well enough that they tell someone else about you. One decision made carefully enough to produce an outcome that cannot be argued with. 1 decade of refusing to let someone else's inability to see you become the truth about who you are. This is not a simple story. It is not a story about one bad interview or one flawed interviewer or one company that made a mistake. It is a story about a system, about the way bias operates not through cruelty but through accumulated, unexamined instinct, about the specific cost that system imposes on specific people, and about what some of those people choose to do with that cost. They do not always come back. They do not always have the specific combination of resources and support and internal resources that Simone had. Dr. Marsh was a resource. Her parents' example was a resource. Her own capacity for the long patience that is actually preparation was a resource. Not everyone has all of those things. That is the part of the story that sits uncomfortably, the part that the success narrative tends to smooth over. Simone Reeves had what she needed to do what she did, and what she did was extraordinary. And the fact that it was extraordinary does not change the fact that it should have been unnecessary. The gap should not have existed in the first place. The file should not have said "not at this time." The morning on the sidewalk at 24 should not have been necessary. These things are both true simultaneously. The outcome was extraordinary. The circumstances that produced the decade of work that produced the outcome were not acceptable. Holding both of those truths at once is perhaps the most important thing this story asks of the people who hear it. Simone Reeves is still the CEO of Meridian Consulting Group. The firm has grown in each of the years she has led it. Its client list has expanded. Its reputation in the industry has shifted in ways that are attributable by any honest analysis to the specific decisions she has made and the specific culture she has built. She speaks publicly now, with some regularity, about the themes she addressed in that keynote, not as an advocate or an activist in the formal sense, as a practitioner, as someone who can demonstrate with the evidence of her own firm's performance that the things she is describing are not matters of principle alone. They are matters of outcomes, of competitive advantage, of the basic business case for seeing people clearly. She has been asked whether she thinks about Philip Graves differently now than she did at 24. She has given this question the consideration it deserves. She has said that what she thinks about now is not Philip Graves specifically, but the pattern he represented. And she has said that what she wants from the visibility she has is not the satisfaction of a personal resolution, but the possibility that the pattern changes, that the people conducting interviews in firms like the one Meridian used to be examine the basis of their instincts before they file the "not at this time" notation, that the candidates who walk in with portfolios assembled from years of preparation in the face of repeated rejection find the room more ready to see them than Simone's room was ready to see her. That the 24-year-old sitting in lobbies for 8 minutes believing they are ready and being correct about that find someone on the 14th floor who is capable of confirming it. This is what she wants. This is what the decade was for. Not the office on the 14th floor, not the CEO title, not the keynote applause. The possibility that the next person does not need a decade to prove what should have been visible on the morning they first walked in. Robert Reeves, Simone's father, attended her CEO installation. He sat in the third row of the auditorium where the formal announcement was made. He was 68 years old. He had retired from teaching 3 years earlier. He had coached the debate team for the last time the year before that. He had watched his daughter, across 3.5 decades, become the most precise and complete version of the person he had believed she was when she was 12 years old, and had sat across from him at the kitchen table and had argued a position he disagreed with for 40 minutes, and had not once resorted to anything except logic and evidence and the patient, relentless willingness to stay in the room until the argument was finished. He did not say anything particularly eloquent at the dinner afterward. He was not a man who performed feeling in public. What he said was, "You did the work." 4 words. She had heard them from him before, in slightly different forms, across different circumstances, at different ages. They had always meant the same thing. They meant, this is how it is supposed to work. This is what we were always talking about. This is the thing. She had done the work. And the work, across 10 years, had done what it always does when it is done completely and without compromise. It had told the truth, loudly enough eventually, that the people who had not been able to hear it the first time had no option left but to listen. The question this story asks is not whether justice was served. Justice is a complicated word, and this story is not a simple story. The question this story asks is one that every person who has ever been told they are not quite the right fit has to answer for themselves. The question is, what do you do with that? Do you accept the assessment? Do you revise your ambition to fit someone else's inability to see you? Or do you do something else? Do you go home and make a plan? Do you find the doctor? Marsh in your life. The person who will tell you clearly that the gap between what they see and what you are is not your problem to accept, but your project to close? Do you build the record that cannot be argued with? Do you stay in it long enough for the results to speak at the volume that the people who could not hear you the first time are finally forced to register? Simone Reeves did all of those things. She will tell you that she did not do them alone. She will tell you about Dr. Marsh and her parents and the clients who became advocates and the colleagues who chose to follow her. She will tell you that the decade was not something she survived through will alone. It was something she built through the accumulated decisions of a lot of people who saw her clearly at the moments when others could not. She is right about all of that. And the question remains, because you are not Simone Reeves, you are yourself. And the question is yours. What do you do with the morning on the sidewalk? What do you do with the promise you make to yourself when no one is listening? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about your sidewalk moment. Tell me what you did with it, or what you wish you had done, or what you are still doing. I want to hear from you. This community is built on the stories that do not get told at award ceremonies, the ones that live in the 10 years in between. Subscribe with notifications on.